The constable from the village arrived within the hour, a man named Watkins who possessed the kind of methodical competence that came from 20 years of policing a quiet corner of the Cotswolds where murders were theoretical rather than practical. He was a solid man of perhaps 55, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his early years as a farmhand before finding steadier work in law enforcement. He stood in Thomas Garrett's study with his notebook open, his pen poised, and the particular expression of a man who had been handed a problem considerably larger than he had anticipated. "Has anyone touched anything?" he asked, though his eyes moved across the room in a way that suggested he already knew the answer. The scene remained largely undisturbed. The letter opener still protruding from Thomas Garrett's chest, the desk lamp still burning, casting its light across papers that appeared to contain nothing more sinister than household accounts and correspondence. "No," Miss Marple said quietly. She had been asked to wait in the study while the family was escorted downstairs, a decision Constable Watkins had made with a kind of instinctive deference to her age and apparent composure. "I closed the door immediately upon discovering the body. I thought it best not to disturb anything further." Watkins nodded approvingly. "You've a sensible head, Miss Marple. I'm a guest of the family." "Right then, Miss Marple. Would you tell me exactly what you observed when you entered the room?" Miss Marple settled herself into the leather chair that Watkins indicated, and her recitation was precise and unhurried. She described the position of the body, the temperature of the flesh. Cold, she noted, suggesting death had occurred some hours previously. The apparent time of the letter opener and the arrangement of papers on the desk. She mentioned, with the kind of careful precision that suggested she understood its importance, that Thomas Garrett's hand lay across a partially completed letter, as though he had been writing when death had interrupted his work. "Any signs of struggle?" Watkins asked. "None that I observed," Miss Marple said. "He appears to have been seated when the letter opener was inserted. There is no evidence of defensive wounds on his hands, though I confess my examination was necessarily cursory." Watkins scribbled notes, his pen moving steadily. "When was he last seen alive, do you know?" "I observed him at dinner," Miss Marple said. "That would have been at approximately 6:30 this evening. He served the soup course and departed to make room for the next course to be brought in. Lady Catherine mentioned that he did not deliver the coffee as was apparently his custom, which would have been shortly after 8 o'clock. So something between 6:30 and 8 o'clock. Yes, though one must consider, Constable, that the body is quite cold and the room itself is rather chilly. The window there," she gestured toward the east-facing window, "is not fully closed. The actual time of death may have been somewhat earlier, or the cold may simply have accelerated the natural cooling of the body." Watkins glanced at the window and then back at Miss Marple with an expression of mild surprise. "You've a medical background, Miss Marple?" "No," she said simply, "but I have lived a long time and observed a great deal." It was at that moment that Dr. Hartley arrived. Not James Hartley, the sculptor, but Dr. Michael Hartley, the local physician who had been summoned by telephone and who carried with him the particular authority of medical knowledge and the particular weariness of a man called out on Christmas Eve. He was 62, with grey hair and the manner of someone who had seen enough human suffering to be neither shocked nor excessively compassionate about it. He examined Thomas Garrett with the efficiency of long practice, moving the body minimally and speaking his observations aloud for Watkins's benefit. "Dead approximately 2 to 3 hours, he said finally. The letter opener penetrated between the ribs on the left side. Depending on which vessel was severed, death would have been relatively quick, 15 minutes perhaps, if he was lucky. Blood loss would have been internal mostly, hence no visible bleeding on the desk or floor. He was dead before the shock wore off properly, I'd say." "And the letter opener?" Watkins asked. "Could an ordinary person have wielded it with sufficient force?" "With anger behind it, certainly," Dr. Hartley said. "No particular strength required. The angle is nearly perfect for someone standing slightly to the left of the chair, driving downward and inward. A woman could manage it as easily as a man, given the correct motivation and sufficient force in the first moment of attack. The implications of this observation settled over the room like fog, and Watkins scribbled additional notes, his pen moving more quickly now. The fact that any member of the household could have committed the murder, the absolute democratization of guilt that Dr. Hartley's medical assessment had created, was both enlightening and profoundly unhelpful. It was Miss Marple who asked the question that seemed, in its simplicity, almost naive. Might we know what the letter was about? The one that Mr. Garrett appeared to be writing when he died? Both men looked at the desk, where the partially completed letter still lay beneath the dead man's hand. Watkins carefully retrieved it using a handkerchief, his movements suggesting that he had absorbed enough from detective fiction to understand the concept of evidence, even if he was not quite certain what he was doing. The letter was addressed to someone named Margaret and contained only 3 lines. "Dear Margaret, I can no longer bear the weight of knowing what I know. Tomorrow I will speak to Sir Edmund about the matter we discussed. After that, the decision must be—" It ended there, mid-sentence, mid-thought, interrupted by violence. Watkins and Dr. Hartley exchanged glances, and Miss Marple knitted her fingers together in her lap, her pale blue eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, as though she were considering a problem of considerably greater magnitude than either man had yet apprehended. The drawing room had transformed into something resembling a nervous waiting room at a provincial hospital. The family had been assembled there under the watchful eye of a young constable named Davies, a man of perhaps 25 whose primary qualification for police work appeared to be his height and his willingness to stand in doorways looking authoritative. The Christmas candles had been extinguished, a small mercy, Miss Marple thought, though it made the room feel considerably colder, and the festive decorations now seemed obscene in their cheerfulness, like laughter at a funeral. Sir Edmund sat in his chair with the expression of a man whose authority had been fundamentally challenged by circumstances beyond his control. His face had progressed from florid to something approximating purple, and he had been drinking port with the single-minded determination of someone seeking oblivion through alcohol. Lady Catherine occupied the sofa, with her knitting abandoned on the cushion beside her, her hands folded in her lap in a posture that suggested prayer, though her expression suggested calculation. Victoria dozed fitfully in a chair near the window, one hand resting on the swell of her pregnancy. Michael stood beside her, watching her sleep with an expression that combined affection and worry in nearly equal measure. Richard and Eleanor occupied opposite ends of the room, not speaking, their earlier marital détente having apparently fractured under the weight of actual crisis. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup, and Richard's jaw was clenched in the particular way of men who are accustomed to controlling their environment and are finding the experience of powerlessness profoundly irritating. Caroline sat near the fireplace, her beautiful face drawn and pale, and James Hartley stood beside her chair with a proprietary hand on her shoulder. His expression was harder to read. He had the kind of face that concealed its thoughts readily, a facility that Miss Marple suspected came from years of observing other people's reactions to his work, waiting for approval or criticism. It was Richard who broke the silence first, his barrister's mind apparently unable to resist the puzzle that had presented itself. "Obviously, it must be someone from outside the house," he said, his tone carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to winning arguments. "A burglar, perhaps, surprised by Garrett and forced to act. The east wing window was not fully closed, after all." "The window was not forced," Lady Catherine said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her with expressions of surprise as though they had forgotten she was capable of speaking. "I noticed it myself years ago. It sticks. One must lift the frame while pulling it closed or it never latches properly. Thomas had mentioned wanting it repaired, but Edmund always said it was not pressing." "That hardly proves anything," Richard countered, though his tone had shifted slightly, acquiring the edge of uncertainty. "A burglar could have known about the window, or he could have opened it from inside after gaining entry through the front door." And how would a burglar gain entry to a locked house on Christmas Eve? Constable Watkins asked. He had returned to the drawing room to conduct preliminary interviews, his notebook now featuring several pages of observations that Miss Marple suspected contained considerably less useful information than Constable Watkins believed. All the doors were locked, the servants confirm it. The only way in would be through the house itself, Miss Marple said softly. She had been sitting quietly in her wing chair, her knitting still in her lap, her attention apparently directed toward the pattern of stitches rather than the conversation, but her voice, when she spoke, carried the quality of someone who had been listening intently to every word. If someone was already in the house when the doors were locked, they could have moved about quite freely. Everyone looked at her, and Constable Watkins leaned forward slightly, his pen poised. "A guest," Lady Catherine said, the realization appearing to dawn on her face. "Or a servant." "There are 8 servants in the household," Sir Edmund said, his voice rough from port and emotion. "Every one of them has been with Winter Hall for years. Every one of them is above suspicion." But his own tone suggested that he understood the absurdity of this statement. No one was above suspicion now. That was what murder did to a household. It corroded the assumption of innocence. It made every person, no matter how long-serving or seemingly loyal, into a potential threat. "The letter," Richard said suddenly, returning to the practical matter of evidence. "The letter that Garrett was writing to this Margaret person. Who is Margaret, and what did he know that was so significant he was planning to speak to Father about it?" "That," Constable Watkins said carefully, "is what I shall need to discover. Does anyone here know of someone named Margaret in connection with Thomas Garrett?" The silence that followed was remarkably complete. Not a single person raised a hand or offered a name, and yet Miss Marple observed with interest that 3 people exchanged glances in that moment. Richard, Eleanor, and Caroline, a triangle of recognition that seemed to suggest that Margaret was not an unknown quantity, but rather someone whose connection to Thomas Garrett was something they had collectively decided not to acknowledge. It was at that precise moment that the telephone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the drawing room with almost violent clarity. Constable Watkins rose to answer it, his movements suggesting that he was grateful for any interruption that might provide a new direction for inquiry. His face, as he listened, underwent a transformation from professional competence to something approximating shock. When he replaced the receiver, his voice carried an entirely new note of urgency. "That was the station," he said to no one in particular. "They've had a telephone call from Ashford Village. There's been another incident. One of the servants, a housemaid named Susan, they found her collapsed in the servants' quarters approximately 30 minutes ago. She's been poisoned." The drawing room seemed to contract in that moment, and Miss Marple set down her knitting with the careful precision of someone preparing herself for something considerably more complex and considerably more dangerous than anyone had yet anticipated. The servants' quarters occupied the basement of Winter Hall, a warren of small rooms connected by narrow corridors that smelled perpetually of damp stone and the particular mustiness that came from being situated below ground level. Susan Blackwell, the housemaid in question, lay on a narrow bed in one of these rooms, her body rigid with the characteristic convulsions of strychnine poisoning. Dr. Hartley had already been summoned back to the house, and he stood beside the bed with his medical bag open, his expression grave in a way that suggested the outcome was already predetermined. "Strychnine," he said, not bothering to soften the word with medical terminology or euphemism. "Absorbed through food or drink, I'd imagine, though I won't know for certain until the body is examined properly. She's been dead perhaps 20 minutes, no more. The convulsions would have been quite violent. Someone would have heard if they were paying attention." "Who discovered her?" Constable Watkins asked. He had brought with him a sergeant named Paulson from the regional police office, a man of 40 with the kind of face that suggested he had seen considerably more of the world's ugliness than Constable Watkins and had made peace with the experience. Paulson was examining the room methodically, his eyes moving across every surface with the focused attention of someone trained to notice detail. "The cook, Mrs. Hughes," one of the other servants replied. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with the worried expression of someone accustomed to managing a household and finding all her carefully constructed order dismantled. Susan didn't come down for her supper, which was unusual. Mrs. Hughes sent me to fetch her, thinking she might be ill. When I found her like this, I fetched Mrs. Hughes immediately, and she called for the doctor. "What had she eaten or drunk today?" Paulson asked, his tone suggesting that the answer mattered considerably. "The same as the rest of us," the woman said. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at 12:30, and she would have had tea at 4 o'clock with the other downstairs staff. Supper is at 6:30, but as I said, she didn't appear. So the poisoning occurred sometime between 4 o'clock and when she was found," Paulson said, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned to Watkins. "The murder of the secretary, and now this. If the same person committed both crimes, we're looking at someone with access to the house, knowledge of poisons, and the ability to move about without being observed. Or," Sergeant Paulson continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned that obvious conclusions were often misleading, "we're looking at someone who wants us to think the crimes are connected when they may not be connected at all. A misdirection. The real murderer creates a second crisis to obscure the first investigation." It was a theory that possessed the uncomfortable ring of possibility, and Constable Watkins's expression suggested that he was beginning to understand that this evening would not conclude with a simple arrest and a neat resolution. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner of the servants' room with her hands folded before her, observed that Susan Blackwell's teacup still sat on the small table beside her bed. It was empty, but the faint smell of bitter almonds, the distinctive odor of cyanide rather than strychnine, she noted with interest, lingered in the air around it. Upstairs, in the drawing room, the family had been informed of the second death with varying degrees of reaction. Eleanor had begun to cry again, a more genuine expression of fear than her earlier hysteria. Victoria had gone very pale, one hand pressed against her belly, as though protecting the child within from the knowledge of violence. Sir Edmund had ceased drinking, and had instead gone very still, his expression suggesting that the edifice of his certainty had begun to crack in earnest. It was Richard who voiced what everyone was thinking, his barrister's mind cutting through the fog of shock and confusion with brutal precision. "We need to know what Thomas Garrett knew," he said, his voice carrying the particular intensity of a man accustomed to cross-examination. "The letter mentioned something that required him to speak to Father, something important enough that someone was willing to kill him to prevent it from being revealed. And now Susan is dead. Was she connected to Garrett? Did she know something as well?" "Susan was a housemaid," Lady Catherine said quietly. "She had worked here for 3 years. I cannot imagine what she could have known that would matter." "But someone thought she mattered," Caroline said, her voice small and frightened. She had moved away from James Hartley's protective hand, as though his presence was now more threatening than comforting. "Someone thought she knew something dangerous enough to kill her." It was at that moment that Miss Marple ascended the stairs from the servants' quarters, her progress slow and deliberate, her expression thoughtful. When she entered the drawing room, Constable Watkins and Sergeant Paulson followed her, and it was Paulson who posed the question that seemed most pressing. Did Thomas Garrett have any particular connection to any member of this household? Any relationship beyond his professional duties as secretary? The silence that followed was informative in its own way. Not complete, but fragmented. There were several people who exchanged glances. Several people who suddenly became intensely interested in their coffee cups or the pattern of the carpet. And there was one person whose face underwent a very subtle but very noticeable shift, a tightening around the eyes that suggested they had just realized something of considerable importance. Miss Marple observed this shift with the focused attention that made her dangerous, and she began, very quietly, to piece together the architecture of the crime in her mind, seeing not the obvious structure but the hidden framework upon which all the rest was built. It was Michael who finally broke the uncomfortable silence, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man walking through a minefield. "Thomas had a daughter," he said quietly. "She lives in the village. Her name is Margaret." The room seemed to contract at this revelation, and Sergeant Paulson's pen moved across his notebook with renewed purpose. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, the most obvious connection. That Thomas Garrett had a child was information that should have been volunteered immediately by the family, should have been common knowledge. Yet it appeared that it was not, or at least that it had been successfully suppressed from casual conversation, which suggested that Margaret Garrett's existence was somehow complicated or inconvenient or both. "How old is she?" Paulson asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. 26, Michael said. "She works as a governess in the village, I believe. I've only met her once, when she came to the house some months ago to speak with her father about some matter or other. I didn't think it was particularly significant at the time." And yet Thomas Garrett was writing to her about something important enough to kill over, Richard said, his analytical mind already constructing theories. Something he intended to reveal to father. Something that required, what were his words, "the weight of knowing what I know." That's a phrase that suggests blackmail, doesn't it? Or conspiracy, or something that compromised the family's interests. "We'll need to speak with the girl," Paulson said to Watkins. "Tonight, if possible. She may have information about what her father intended to disclose." "In this fog?" Lady Catherine said. Her voice carried no particular objection, merely an observation of practical difficulty. "The village is 3 miles distant. The roads will be nearly impassable." "Then we shall manage as best we can," Paulson said. He turned to address the assembled family. "In the meantime, no one is to leave Winter Hall. This is now a murder inquiry involving 2 deaths, and until we understand the connection between them and identify the person responsible, everyone in this house remains under suspicion and under observation. Is that understood?" The weight of his words settled over the drawing room like a physical presence. 2 deaths. Not an accident, not an isolated incident of violence, but a systematic elimination of people who possessed knowledge that someone in this house, or someone connected to this house, deemed dangerous enough to kill for. It was Eleanor who asked the question that articulated the fear underlying everything else. "Are we all in danger?" she whispered. "Is there a murderer still loose in this house?" No one answered her, which was answer enough. Miss Marple, observing the reactions that followed Eleanor's question, noticed several things of interest. Richard's jaw tightened as though he were bracing himself for something. Caroline's hand moved to clutch at her dress. James Hartley's expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a tautness in his shoulders that hadn't been present moments before. And Victoria, pregnant, exhausted Victoria, looked at her husband with an expression that combined trust and vulnerability in a way that suggested she believed Michael possessed knowledge. She did not. Knowledge that might keep her safe if only she could access it. But it was Sir Edmund's reaction that Miss Marple found most revealing. He had gone very still, his florid face draining of colour, and his hand had begun to tremble slightly as he reached for his port glass. Whatever Thomas Garrett had intended to reveal, it was something that Sir Edmund had been dreading, something that his secretary's death had prevented, but had not entirely eliminated. Because Margaret Garrett existed, and Margaret Garrett presumably knew, or at least suspected, what her father had known. "I should like to speak with Miss Garrett," Miss Marple said softly. Her voice was so quiet that several people had to lean forward to hear her. "If Constable Watkins and Sergeant Paulson have no objection, I might accompany them to the village. A woman's presence might make her more comfortable discussing sensitive matters. And I do have some experience with listening to confessions." The understatement was so profound as to be almost humorous, and Sergeant Paulson regarded Miss Marple with an expression of increased interest. He was a man who had learned to pay attention to elderly women, having found that they frequently possessed a clarity of perception that younger people lacked. And he nodded his agreement without hesitation. "Very well, Miss Marple, but we leave in 15 minutes. Constable Watkins will accompany us. The rest of you will remain here under observation." The fog outside had thickened considerably, transforming the Cotswold landscape into something abstract and threatening. As Miss Marple gathered her coat and prepared for the journey to the village, she found herself thinking about Margaret Garrett, about what knowledge a young woman in a small village might possess, and about the particular vulnerability of people who knew dangerous secrets in households where murder had already become possible. In the drawing room behind her, the family settled into an uneasy vigil, each person alone with their thoughts and their fears, and with the gnawing awareness that one of them, or someone they had collectively failed to suspect, had already killed twice and might be capable of killing again. The Christmas candles remained unlit, and the house that had been so warm and festive mere hours before now felt cold and predatory, full of shadows and secrets that had been waiting a long time to surface. The cottage where Margaret Garrett lived was situated at the far end of the village, a small stone structure that had once been a gamekeeper's lodge before being converted into modest residential quarters. The fog had rendered the journey perilous, the motor car moving at a crawl through streets that appeared and disappeared like fever dreams. Miss Marple sat in the back seat beside Sergeant Paulson, her knitting abandoned at Winter Hall, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone accustomed to uncertainty. Margaret Garrett answered the door on the third knock, her expression shifting from irritation to alarm when she recognized Constable Watkins in his uniform. She was a tall woman, taller than her father had been, with the same thin face and grey-touched hair, though her eyes held a quality of intelligence and wariness that suggested she had learned early to be suspicious of authority and its intentions. "What's happened?" she asked immediately, not bothering with pleasantries. "Has something occurred at Winter Hall?" "May we come inside, Miss Garrett?" Sergeant Paulson asked gently. "It would be better to discuss this matter in private." The cottage was small but meticulously maintained, and Margaret showed them into a sitting room that was noticeably cold, suggesting she had been economizing with her fuel. She did not offer them tea or attempt hospitality, which Miss Marple found informative. Instead, she sat on the edge of a chair, her body rigid with the tension of someone bracing for catastrophic news. "Your father is dead," Paulson said without preamble, which was, Miss Marple reflected, the kindest approach to such information. There was no point in delaying or softening the blow. "He was killed at Winter Hall this evening, sometime between 6:30 and 8 o'clock. We have reason to believe it was connected to information he intended to disclose to Sir Edmund Ashford." Margaret's reaction was not what Miss Marple had anticipated. There was shock, certainly, and grief, genuine grief that registered in the sudden pallor of her face and the way her hands gripped the armrest of her chair. But there was also something else, something that looked remarkably like resignation, as though she had been expecting this news for some considerable time and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. "He was going to tell them," Margaret said quietly, after a long moment of silence. "I told him not to. I told him it would only make things worse, that some secrets were better left buried, but Father was determined to do what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences." "Tell us what, Miss Garrett?" Miss Marple asked softly. Her voice was so gentle that it seemed almost conversational, yet Margaret's eyes moved to her with the recognition of someone who understood that this elderly woman possessed both compassion and the capacity to perceive truth. Margaret took a breath that seemed to require considerable effort. About Richard Ashford's wife, about Eleanor, about what she did. The room seemed to shift slightly on its axis, and Sergeant Paulson leaned forward, his entire attention concentrated on Margaret's face. "What did Eleanor Ashford do, Miss Garrett?" "She killed a woman," Margaret said. The words emerged flatly, without emotion, as though she had rehearsed them many times in her own mind. 6 years ago, before she married Richard, Father knew about it because the woman was his sister, my aunt. Her name was Rachel. The weight of this revelation seemed to press down on the small room, and Miss Marple observed that Margaret's hands had begun to tremble slightly, as though speaking the truth aloud had cost her considerably. Eleanor and Rachel were friends, Margaret continued, or at least Eleanor claimed they were friends. Rachel was working as a nurse at the hospital in Gloucestershire at the time. Eleanor worked in the same hospital in the administrative offices. Father said they seemed to spend a great deal of time together, and then one day Rachel simply disappeared. Everyone assumed she had eloped with a man, that she had gone to London or somewhere equally distant. But Father received a letter months later. It was from Eleanor, and it contained a confession. She said that Rachel had discovered something about Eleanor, something about money that Eleanor had taken from the hospital. Eleanor said that Rachel threatened to report her, and that in a moment of panic and rage, Eleanor had struck her with a heavy instrument and left her to die in the supply room. "And what became of the body?" Paulson asked, his voice remaining carefully neutral. "Eleanor said she weighted it and threw it into the river," Margaret said. "The river was high that winter, swollen with rain. By the time anyone might have found it, there would have been nothing left to identify. Eleanor said she was writing to confess because she could no longer bear the guilt, because she was planning to marry Richard Ashford and she wanted him to know the truth before committing herself to him. But Father said that Eleanor never did tell Richard. Instead, she kept the letter, and she somehow convinced Father to keep her secret. She said that if he reported her, it would destroy Richard's life and that Richard had nothing to do with her crime. She said that she had changed, that she was living in constant fear of discovery, and that maintaining her secret was punishment enough. "And your father agreed to this arrangement?" Miss Marple asked gently. "He did," Margaret said, and her voice cracked slightly. "He said that justice had already claimed Rachel, and that adding Richard's suffering to that would not bring her back. He said he was old and would likely die soon anyway, and that the truth would come out eventually. But he wanted to die knowing he had tried to do the right thing. He wanted to tell Sir Edmund, to put the matter in the hands of the authorities and let the law determine what should be done. He was planning to do it tomorrow. He was going to speak to Sir Edmund tomorrow." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, her pale blue gaze seemed to have penetrated considerably deeper into the nature of human motivation and human desperation than it had before. "And Eleanor knew that he intended to do this?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Margaret whispered, "but I imagine she must have suspected. Father was old. He had been growing increasingly troubled. Eleanor is not a stupid woman. She would have recognized that time was running out." The return journey to Winter Hall was conducted in near total silence, the motor car crawling through the fog with the deliberation of a hearse. Sergeant Paulson sat in the front seat beside Constable Watkins, his mind visibly working through the implications of what Margaret Garrett had revealed. Miss Marple occupied the back seat alone, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she was considering not just what had been said, but what had been deliberately left unsaid. Eleanor Ashford had killed before. Eleanor Ashford had convinced Thomas Garrett to keep her secret. Eleanor Ashford was married to a man whose future and reputation were bound up in her respectability. These were facts that arranged themselves into a clear pattern of motive, and yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the neatness of the solution. In her experience, when a mystery seemed to resolve itself too readily into obvious guilt, it was often because someone was deliberately constructing a narrative that would direct suspicion toward a predetermined target. When they arrived back at Winter Hall, the house had the appearance of a ship running aground, all its lights burning despite the late hour, servants moving about with the anxious purposefulness of people uncertain whether they were still employed or had become part of a crime scene. Sergeant Paulson went immediately to find Sir Edmund and Richard, leaving Miss Marple and Constable Watkins in the entrance hall. "You see how it must be," Watkins said, his tone suggesting he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Eleanor discovered that Thomas Garrett was planning to reveal her secret. She poisoned Susan, who must have stumbled upon some evidence. Perhaps she overheard something or found something incriminating, and she killed Thomas to silence him permanently. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, Constable, I find myself wondering about the mechanics of the poisoning. Susan Blackwell drank tea in her room sometime between 4 o'clock and the time she was found. The tea was poisoned. How did Eleanor Ashford introduce poison into Susan's tea without being observed? She's been in the drawing room much of the evening, in full view of everyone." "She could have poisoned it earlier," Watkins suggested, "during the afternoon when people were scattered about the house preparing for dinner." "But how would she have known which teacup was Susan's?" Miss Marple asked. "How would she have known that Susan would drink it in her room rather than consuming it in the servants' hall with the other staff? The poisoning seems to require either considerable luck or considerable knowledge of Susan's habits and routines." Watkins appeared momentarily deflated by this logic, and it was at that moment that Sergeant Paulson emerged from the library with Richard and Sir Edmund, both men looking considerably more distressed than they had before. Richard's face was flushed with anger, and Sir Edmund appeared to have aged a decade in the hours since dinner. "We need to speak with Eleanor," Paulson said, his tone carrying the weight of someone about to make an arrest. "Now, where is she?" "In her room," Richard said, his voice tight. "She said she had a headache and retired. But Paulson, I need to tell you, I knew nothing about any of this. Eleanor never told me. If what this girl says is true, then my wife is a murderer, and I've been living with a murderer for 5 years." There was something in his tone that Miss Marple found interesting, not the shock and betrayal one might expect, but rather something closer to relief, as though he had suddenly understood some previous confusion and was grateful for the clarity, no matter how terrible that clarity might be. They climbed the stairs together, a procession that seemed to draw the attention of every servant in the house. Eleanor's room was on the 2nd floor in the west wing, and when Sergeant Paulson knocked on the door, there was no response. After a second knock, more forceful, Richard produced a key and unlocked the door from the outside. Eleanor lay on her bed, fully clothed, with a glass and bottle beside her on the nightstand. The smell of bitter almonds, the same smell that had emanated from Susan Blackwell's teacup, was faint but unmistakable. Her eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling with the particular vacancy of death, and her skin had already begun to assume the waxy pallor that suggested her death had occurred some hours previously. "Good God," Richard whispered, the color draining from his face. "She knew. She must have known that we would discover the truth. She poisoned herself." But Miss Marple, moving closer to the bed with the careful deliberation of age, noticed several things that seemed to contradict this simple narrative. Eleanor's hands were relaxed, not clutched or rigid as one might expect from someone who had deliberately consumed poison. The bottle beside her contained laudanum, not cyanide, and most significantly, there appeared to be a faint mark on her arm, barely visible on the pale skin, that looked remarkably like the trace of a recent injection. "Sergeant Paulson," Miss Marple said quietly, "I wonder whether you might examine this mark on Miss Ashford's arm more carefully, and whether you might ask Dr. Hartley to determine not only the cause of death, but also the time of death with considerable precision." Paulson looked at where she was pointing, and his expression underwent a subtle shift, a recognition that the apparent suicide might be considerably more complicated than it appeared. "You're suggesting she didn't poison herself," he said slowly. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that we should establish facts before constructing narratives. Because if Eleanor Ashford died before Thomas Garrett was murdered, then she could not have been responsible for either death, regardless of what secrets she may have harbored." The silence that followed was comprehensive and absolute, and Miss Marple saw the moment when both Sergeant Paulson and Constable Watkins understood that they had been proceeding along a false path. that the real murderer was still among them, still hidden within the family that gathered downstairs in the drawing room, waiting to learn the outcome of an investigation that had just been fundamentally redirected. Dr. Hartley arrived within 20 minutes, his face showing the particular exhaustion of a man who had been pulled from his bed multiple times in a single evening. He examined Eleanor's body with the same methodical precision he had applied to Thomas Garrett, and his conclusions, when he finally spoke them, altered the entire architecture of the investigation. "She's been dead approximately 6 to 7 hours, he said, consulting his pocket watch and performing mental calculations. "I would estimate time of death between 1 and 2 o'clock this afternoon. That would place her death well before the murder of Thomas Garrett and considerably before the poisoning of Susan Blackwell." The implications of this statement rippled through the assembled investigators like a stone thrown into still water. Eleanor Ashford could not have committed the crimes attributed to her. Eleanor Ashford had been dead for the majority of the evening, lying in her room while everyone below assumed she was merely resting, which meant that someone else had murdered Thomas Garrett, someone else had poisoned Susan Blackwell, and someone else had then murdered Eleanor Ashford to eliminate her as a threat, or for some other reason entirely. "The injection mark," Dr. Hartley continued, examining Eleanor's arm more closely, "suggests cyanide administered intravenously, considerably more efficient than oral poisoning, considerably more premeditated. This was not a crime of passion or panic. This was deliberate, methodical murder." Sergeant Paulson had gone very still, his earlier confidence displaced entirely by the recognition that the case had become considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. He looked at Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he understood she had just saved him from making a catastrophic error in judgment. "We need to know everything about Eleanor Ashford's movements today," he said to Constable Watkins. "Who saw her last? When was she last observed alive? And we need to know it precisely." The answer came from Lady Catherine, who remembered with remarkable clarity that Eleanor had complained of a headache shortly after lunch, around 1 o'clock. She had retired to her room to rest, and no one had seen her since. No one had checked on her, no one had brought her anything to eat or drink, and no one had any reason to believe anything was amiss until Eleanor failed to appear for dinner. "So the window is between 1 o'clock and the time dinner was served," Paulson said. "Between 1 and 6:30, that gives us a 5.5-hour window in which someone had access to Eleanor's room, had access to cyanide, and had the knowledge to administer it intravenously." "Who knew that Eleanor was resting?" Miss Marple asked softly. She was sitting in a chair in Eleanor's room, observing the scene with the focused attention of someone whose mind was working through a complex geometric problem. Who would have had reason to visit her room during that time? "Her husband," Paulson said immediately, "though he was in London until this afternoon. Her servants, there is a lady's maid assigned to her, I believe. Her family members, anyone who had reason to check on her or bring her something." It was at that moment that Constable Watkins returned with new information, his expression suggesting he had discovered something of considerable significance. "Sir," he said to Paulson, "the servants report that James Hartley, the sculptor, was seen in the hallway near Mrs. Eleanor's room at approximately 1:30 this afternoon. He told the housemaid he was looking for the library, but that hallway doesn't lead to the library." The name hung in the air like an accusation, and Miss Marple found herself thinking about James Hartley, about the careful neutrality of his expression when the murders had been discussed, about the way he had stood beside Caroline with an ease that suggested either genuine affection or considerable comfort with deception. "Where is Mr. Hartley now?" Paulson asked, his tone sharpening. "Still in the house," Watkins confirmed. "He's in the drawing room with the Saarbrüts, others. Should I bring him to the library?" Paulson said. "Tell him we need to ask him some routine questions about his movements this evening." But Miss Marple raised one hand slightly, a gesture so economical that it might have been mistaken for an involuntary movement if one hadn't observed the precision with which it arrested Paulson's attention. "If I may offer a suggestion, Sergeant," she said quietly, "I wonder whether it might be more productive to approach this matter indirectly." Mr. Hartley is clearly an intelligent man, and if he has committed these murders, he will have constructed a narrative to explain any direct questioning. It might be more instructive to observe how he reacts to information he believes is merely circumstantial. Paulson regarded her thoughtfully for a long moment and then nodded his agreement. "Very well. What do you propose?" "I should like to speak with him myself," Miss Marple said. "An elderly woman asking innocent questions about the evening's events. He will not perceive me as a threat, and I suspect that if I approach him correctly, he may reveal something of considerable significance." It was an arrangement that Paulson accepted with the grace of a man who had learned that intuition and observation often surpassed procedural interrogation. Within minutes, Miss Marple descended the stairs and made her way to the drawing room where James Hartley sat with Caroline, his hand resting on her shoulder in that same gesture of proprietorial comfort that she had observed earlier. "Mr. Hartley," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself into a chair near him, "I wonder if you might help an old woman understand the events of this evening. I find myself so confused by everything that has occurred, and I thought perhaps you might clarify some details for me." James Hartley's expression shifted into one of solicitous concern, and he smiled at her with the particular charm that had clearly served him well throughout his life. He had no idea, Miss Marple reflected, that she was about to begin the careful work of dismantling the narrative he had constructed, one innocent question at a time. "You are very kind to take time to speak with me," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the gentle tremor of advanced age. "I confess that I have become quite bewildered by all of this dreadful business. I was wondering, Mr. Hartley, if you might tell me what you observed during the afternoon. Before the terrible discovery, I mean. I find that young people often notice things that we elderly folk miss entirely." James Hartley's expression remained pleasant, though Miss Marple observed a slight tightening around his eyes, a minute tension that suggested he understood, on some level, that this apparently harmless inquiry was more significant than it appeared. "I spent most of the afternoon in my room," he said smoothly. "Reading, primarily. The fog made it difficult to do anything else, and I was hoping to rest before dinner. I'm afraid I didn't observe much of anything." "How fortunate that you were resting," Miss Marple said, settling back in her chair as though the matter were of no consequence. "I imagine the household was quite quiet during the afternoon hours. Everyone occupied with their own pursuits. Tell me, did you happen to encounter any of the family members in the hallways? I've always found that even in large houses, one invariably crosses paths with others." There was a pause, barely perceptible, before Hartley responded. "I may have seen one of the servants," he said, "but I confess I took little notice. My mind was elsewhere." "How very true," Miss Marple agreed. "The mind does wander when we are preoccupied. I myself was thinking about the Christmas preparations, wondering where certain items had been stored. I even ventured into the hallway near Mrs. Eleanor's room, thinking perhaps the linen closet might be located there. Did you happen to notice the linen closet during your afternoon? I find it so difficult to navigate in unfamiliar houses." The question was so innocent, so obviously guileless, that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed the sudden rigidity in James Hartley's shoulders, the way his hand on Caroline's shoulder had become almost imperceptibly tighter. "I'm afraid not," he said. His voice remained pleasant, but there was now a quality of tension beneath it, like music played slightly too fast. "As I said, I remained in my room." "Of course you did," Miss Marple said softly. She turned her attention to her knitting, which she had retrieved from the drawing-room table, as though the matter had been entirely resolved to her satisfaction. It is so easy to mistake which rooms are which in a house as large as Winter Hall. The hallways all look rather similar, don't they? Particularly in the afternoon light, when the fog obscures the windows. Caroline, who had been silent throughout this exchange, began to look distinctly uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, and her hand moved to touch James Hartley's arm with an uncertainty that suggested she was beginning to suspect something she did not yet fully comprehend. "Mr. Hartley," Miss Marple continued, her needles clicking together with rhythmic precision. "I've been wondering about your work. Sculpture, is it? I imagine that requires considerable knowledge of the human body. One must understand anatomy to represent it accurately, mustn't one? The placement of muscles, the structure of veins and arteries. That must be essential knowledge for an artist." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Even Caroline seemed to understand in that moment that whatever was happening in this conversation had moved far beyond polite inquiry into territory that was considerably more dangerous. "I'm not entirely certain what you're implying, Miss Marple," Hartley said, and there was now an edge to his voice that had not been present before. "But I find your line of questioning rather odd." "Do you?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, and her pale blue eyes met his with a directness that seemed to pierce through all the careful construction of charm and plausibility he had assembled. "I apologize if I have been unclear. It is the weakness of age, I suppose. But I find myself troubled by several small inconsistencies in the evening's events. For instance, I wonder how someone who spent the afternoon in his room could have known about the letter opener that killed Thomas Garrett. You see, when we discovered the body, the letter opener was still in place. No one had mentioned it to anyone in the drawing room. And yet you seemed to know, quite early in the evening, that Thomas had been killed with a letter opener. You mentioned it to Caroline, I believe, before Sergeant Paulson had revealed that detail to the family." The room seemed to contract around them, and Miss Marple observed that James Hartley had begun to understand, with absolute certainty, that he had been caught in his own deception. "I may have overheard someone discussing it," he said, but the explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "But there is another matter that troubles me even more. You see, I have lived a very long time, and I have known many people who have had access to medical knowledge. Doctors, nurses, chemists. But there is something about the way Eleanor Ashford was murdered. The precision of it, the knowledge of anatomy required to administer poison intravenously without leaving obvious traces, that suggests more than merely casual knowledge. It suggests the knowledge of someone who has studied the human body very carefully indeed. Someone, perhaps, who has rendered it in sculpture. Someone who understands exactly where the major veins and arteries are located." She set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the terrible gentleness of someone who had finally arrived at the conclusion of a long and sorrowful investigation. "You killed Eleanor Ashford, didn't you, Mr. Hartley? You killed her because she discovered something about you, something that threatened everything you had constructed. And then, when Thomas Garrett threatened to expose secrets that would have led directly to you, you killed him as well, and poor Susan Blackwell, who must have seen something or heard something that made you nervous. All 3 murders, Mr. Hartley. All 3 committed by you." The drawing room seemed to hold its breath. Caroline had gone very pale, her hand falling away from James Hartley's arm as though she had suddenly recognized that she had been sitting beside a stranger all along. The other family members, who had been scattered about the room in various attitudes of anxious waiting, had begun to understand that something significant was unfolding, and they turned their attention toward Miss Marple and James Hartley with the focused intensity of people witnessing the revelation of a truth they had not anticipated. James Hartley's face underwent a transformation. The careful charm, the practiced smile, the calculated warmth, all of it seemed to drain away like water through a sieve, leaving behind something harder and considerably more dangerous. His hand, which had rested so gently on Caroline's shoulder, had become a fist. "You're an old woman, making wild accusations based on circumstantial detail," he said, his voice now stripped of all pretense of civility. "You have no proof of anything. You're simply a busybody who has watched too many detective novels and has convinced herself she understands something she does not." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said quietly, "I understand quite a great deal. You see, Mr. Hartley, I've spent 84 years observing human nature, and I've learned that people's fundamental characters do not change, regardless of what circumstances they find themselves in. You came to Winter Hall with the intention of marrying Caroline Ashford, not because you loved her. I think you are incapable of genuine love, but because she represented access to money and social position. You had squandered your own resources, and you needed to rebuild yourself. Caroline represented opportunity. This is absurd, Hartley said, but he had not moved, and there was something in his stillness that suggested he understood the futility of denial. Then Eleanor discovered something, Miss Marple continued. I am not entirely certain what, but I suspect it had to do with Caroline. Perhaps Eleanor noticed inconsistencies in your story. Perhaps she began to investigate your background. Eleanor was not a stupid woman, Mr. Hartley. She was, in fact, quite intelligent, and she had spent 5 years observing human behavior from a position of considerable vulnerability. She knew what secrets looked like. When you went to her room this afternoon, ostensibly to discuss something with her, or perhaps to retrieve something you had lost, she confronted you with what she had discovered, and you panicked. You had brought cyanide with you, thinking perhaps you might need it. You're a man who plans for contingencies, aren't you? You administered it intravenously because you knew it would be faster, more certain, and less likely to be detected immediately. Caroline had begun to cry, silent tears streaming down her face as she contemplated the depth of the deception she had been subjected to. Victoria watched from her seat with one protective hand on her belly, her expression suggesting that she understood she had narrowly avoided inviting a murderer into her own family. Then came Thomas Garrett, Miss Marple said, her voice remaining soft and relentless. Thomas knew something about Eleanor's death, or he suspected it. Perhaps he had heard Eleanor cry out. Perhaps he had seen something that troubled him. He was planning to speak to Sir Edmund about what he knew. You couldn't permit that. So you went to his study. You had access to the house. You knew the servants' schedules. You knew when he would be alone. You used the letter opener because it was available, because it was elegant in its way, because it required no planning beyond the moment. And then you made your mistake. Hartley's jaw clenched, and for the first time, something that might have been fear flickered across his face. You didn't account for Susan Blackwell, Miss Marple continued. She must have seen you, or heard something, or found something that made her nervous. She was a servant, easily dismissed, easily overlooked, but she had become a liability. And when you realized she might talk to the police, when you understood that her testimony might connect you to Thomas Garrett's death, you poisoned her tea. Cyanide again, administered when she was in her room, when no one was watching. You thought no one would notice. You thought that in the confusion of 3 deaths, one more would simply be attributed to the same killer as the others. You cannot prove any of this, Hartley said, but his voice had become hollow, the last resort of a man who understood that proof was irrelevant now, that the architecture of his deception had been dismantled, that the only question remaining was whether he would accept his exposure or attempt to flee into the fog. It was Sergeant Paulson who stepped forward from the doorway where he and Constable Watkins had been listening to Miss Marple's exposition. Actually, Mr. Hartley, we can prove a considerable amount. We found a syringe in your room with traces of cyanide still present. We found cyanide powder in your belongings. We found correspondence suggesting you had applied for a position as a tutor in several families of considerable wealth. Applications made under false names with fabricated credentials. We found evidence that your previous marriage ended under circumstances considerably more suspicious than you have indicated. I want my solicitor, Hartley said flatly. I'm sure you do, Paulson replied. He gestured to Constable Watkins, who stepped forward with handcuffs. James Hartley, I'm placing you under arrest for the murders of Eleanor Ashford, Thomas Garrett, and Susan Blackwell. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used in evidence against you. As Watkins led him away, Hartley looked back at Caroline with an expression that was almost contemptuous as though she were beneath his consideration now that she had served her purpose. Caroline looked away, unable to bear the sight of him, and Miss Marple reflected, with the weary understanding of someone who had seen the full spectrum of human capacity for deception, that the young woman would spend a considerable portion of her life understanding how thoroughly she had been deceived. The drawing-room fell silent in the aftermath of James Hartley's departure. All sat massive, silence that seemed to encompass not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of certainty itself. The Christmas candles remained unlit, and the decorations that had seemed so festive mere hours before now appeared almost mocking in their insistence on joy and continuity in a house that had been fundamentally altered by violence and betrayal. It was Sir Edmund who spoke first, his voice rough and diminished, the bravado that had characterized him earlier entirely absent. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "I don't understand any of it. Eleanor. Why would he kill Eleanor? What could she possibly have known that warranted such a thing?" Miss Marple, who had returned to her chair and retrieved her knitting, regarded Sir Edmund with the gentle but unflinching gaze of someone who had glimpsed the full architecture of human weakness and found it neither surprising nor entirely condemnable. "Eleanor discovered that Mr. Hartley had married Caroline under false pretenses," she said quietly. She had begun to investigate his background, and she found inconsistencies in his story. When she confronted him with her suspicions, he understood that she would not remain silent. Eleanor was a woman of principle, you see, even if those principles were sometimes expressed through cruelty. She would have warned Caroline, would have encouraged her to break the engagement, would have ensured that the family understood exactly what manner of man had insinuated himself into their household. Mr. Hartley could not permit that. His entire plan depended upon Caroline accepting his proposal, upon the marriage occurring, upon his securing access to family funds and social position. Eleanor threatened all of that. "But the letter," Richard said, his analytical mind still grappling with the details. "The letter that Father found in Eleanor's room, the one she allegedly wrote confessing to killing Rachel Garrett. Was that genuine?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I suspect Mr. Hartley wrote that letter himself, or had Eleanor write it under duress before he killed her. He intended it to be discovered during the investigation into Thomas Garrett's death. When it was found, the police would naturally assume that Eleanor had killed Thomas to prevent him from exposing her crime, and that Eleanor had then taken her own life out of guilt and fear. It was an elegant solution, 2 murders explained by a single narrative, the real murderer safely positioned outside the circle of suspicion. But Eleanor never actually killed anyone," Victoria said softly, one hand pressed against her belly as though she needed to ground herself in the reality of the life she carried. She was innocent of the crime she was confessing to, and she died because of that innocence. "Not entirely innocent," Sir Edmund said, and everyone turned to look at him. His face was grey and his hands trembled as he reached for his port glass. "Eleanor knew about Rachel Garrett's death. She knew what Thomas had done, or rather, what I had done. I was the one who struck Rachel down. I was the one who disposed of her body. I was the one who—" His voice broke, and he seemed to collapse inward, as though the weight of 60 years of carefully maintained deception had finally become too much to bear. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Miss Marple observed that Michael had moved protectively toward Victoria, while Richard stared at his father with an expression that combined horror and a terrible kind of understanding. "But how did Eleanor know?" Richard asked, his voice small. "She overheard a conversation," Sir Edmund said heavily. "Years ago, when she was first engaged to you, Thomas and I were discussing the matter, discussing whether the time had come to confess, to end the deception. Eleanor heard fragments of it and pieced together the truth. She confronted me, and I told her everything. I begged her to keep the secret, told her that revealing it would destroy your future, would destroy the family's reputation. She agreed, but she held it over me like a sword. She knew that if she ever felt I had treated her unjustly, if she ever felt that Richard was slipping away from her, or that her position in the family was threatened, she could expose me. It was a form of power, I suppose. Eleanor was never comfortable without power. "And Thomas Garrett knew all of this?" Paulson asked. His notebook was open, and he was recording Sir Edmund's confession with the meticulous care of a man who understood that this moment would determine the shape of the legal proceedings to come. "Thomas knew everything," Sir Edmund confirmed. "He was my friend, my confidant, my conscience. He carried the weight of my crime as though it were his own, and over the years he became increasingly troubled by the secrecy. He wanted to confess, wanted to go to the police, wanted to finally bring the matter to some kind of resolution. I begged him not to. I told him that nothing could bring Rachel back, that destroying myself and my family would only create more suffering. But Thomas was growing old, growing weak. He understood that time was running out, that he would not carry this secret to his grave. He was planning to speak to me, to force me to make a choice, confess, or he would confess for me." "And Eleanor knew of his intention?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I told her," Sir Edmund said. "I told her that Thomas might finally force my hand, might force the truth into the open. And Eleanor, who had used this secret as her tool of power all these years, understood that her leverage would disappear if the truth came out in that fashion. She wanted to maintain control of the narrative. She went to Eleanor's room to speak with her, to warn her, to discuss strategy, but Mr. Hartley was already there. The pieces of the puzzle seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, and Miss Marple saw, with perfect clarity, the terrible chain of events that had been set in motion by a single act of violence 60 years previous. A young woman killed in a moment of panic, a secret buried and carried by two men for decades, a wife who transformed that secret into a weapon of control, and finally, a man who understood that secrets were liabilities, that loose ends needed to be tied up, that the only permanent solution to the problem of Eleanor Ashford's knowledge was Eleanor Ashford herself. "What will happen now?" Caroline asked quietly. She had been silent throughout the revelations, and her voice was barely audible. "To father? To the family? That will be a matter for the courts," Sergeant Paulson said, his tone suggesting that he understood the terrible position in which Sir Edmund now found himself. The murder of Rachel Garrett had occurred 60 years ago, beyond the statute of limitations for most crimes. But the conspiracy to conceal it, the obstruction of justice, the knowledge that a murderer had never been held accountable, these were matters that would require legal resolution. It was Miss Marple who answered Caroline's question, her voice carrying the weight of long experience and hard-won wisdom. "What happens now is that the truth becomes known. What happens now is that Rachel Garrett's death is finally acknowledged, that her family receives the dignity of knowing what became of her. What happens now is that justice, though delayed, finally begins to move forward. It will be difficult, it will be painful, but it is necessary." The room had begun to empty as the night wore on. Sir Edmund had been taken to the village to make his statement to the authorities. Richard had left to inform his young son of the dissolution of everything the boy had believed about his family. Victoria and Michael had retired, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the evening and concerned for the welfare of the child Victoria carried. It was Caroline and Miss Marple who remained in the drawing-room as the first light of Christmas morning began to grey the fog outside the windows. Caroline had asked Miss Marple to sit with her, and the old woman had agreed with the kind of understanding that came from having witnessed the full spectrum of human suffering. "How did you know?" Caroline asked finally. "How did you understand what no one else could see?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. "I have lived a very long time," she said gently, "and I have learned that people reveal themselves not through their words, but through their reactions. Mr. Hartley was too composed, too controlled. He had constructed a narrative so carefully that he believed himself invulnerable to detection. But when I mentioned Eleanor's room, when I mentioned the letter opener, When I mentioned anatomy, each time he revealed the slight tension of someone who understood that a detail had been noticed, that a thread had been pulled. And there is something else, my dear, something that old age has taught me. What is that? Caroline asked. That evil is rarely original, Miss Marple said. Mr. Hartley's pattern of behavior, the fabricated credentials, the false courtship, the careful construction of a false identity, these are not unique to him. I've seen similar patterns before, in different places, in different contexts. And once you recognize the pattern, once you understand how such people think and operate, it becomes relatively simple to see through their deceptions. They rely on being underestimated, on charming people into overlooking inconsistencies. But an old woman, sitting quietly in a corner, knitting, observing. An old woman is invisible precisely because she is perceived as harmless. And that invisibility is where understanding grows. Caroline wept then, tears of grief and relief, and the terrible understanding that she had been used, that her love had been cynically manipulated, that the future she had envisioned had been nothing but elaborate fiction. Miss Marple remained beside her, knitting steadily, the needles clicking together in their rhythmic pattern, the pale blue yarn accumulating in her lap like the slow accumulation of years and understanding and the patient observation of human nature in all its complexity. By the time Christmas morning had fully arrived, the fog had begun to lift. The winter sun emerged tentatively from behind the clouds, casting pale light across the Cotswold landscape and illuminating Winter Hall as though nothing had changed, as though the house had not been transformed from a place of festive safety into a place marked by violence and betrayal and the terrible revelation of secrets that had been carefully buried for decades. Sir Edmund faced trial for the conspiracy to conceal murder. James Hartley was convicted on all 3 counts and sentenced to death, a sentence he accepted with the same careful composure with which he had constructed his lies. Rachel Garrett's remains were never found, but her death was finally acknowledged, her family given the dignity of knowing that justice, though imperfect and delayed, had eventually reached out to encompass the crime that had taken her life. And Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead, where she resumed her quiet life of observation and knitting, carrying with her the understanding that human nature contained multitudes. Great capacity for deception, certainly, but also great capacity for loyalty and love, and the slow, patient work of building truth from the careful observation of detail. She never spoke of her role in unmasking James Hartley, never sought credit or recognition. But the village folk, who knew her as they knew their own gardens, understood that Miss Marple possessed a penetrating wisdom that went far beyond her gentle demeanor and elderly appearance. The candles of Winter Hall, once lit with the promise of Christmas joy, had been extinguished by violence. But in their place, Miss Marple had illuminated something else. The possibility that truth, though it might take decades to emerge, could eventually overcome deception, that justice, though imperfect, could finally reach those who believed themselves safe from its consequences, and that an old woman's quiet observation could prove more powerful than all the authority and certainty that the world could marshal against her. Christmas had been transformed from a celebration of joy into a meditation on the terrible consequences of secrets and lies. But as Miss Marple sat by her fire in St. Mary Mead on Boxing Day, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, she reflected that perhaps this was not entirely a tragedy. Perhaps the truth, no matter how painful, was always preferable to the comfortable deceptions in which people often chose to live. And perhaps the role of those who observed carefully, who listened patiently, who understood the deep patterns of human behavior, perhaps their role was simply to illuminate what had been hidden, and to trust that truth, once revealed, would eventually find its proper place in the world.